Chapter 8. But redolent of joy and consolation as is the intercourse with beloved friends, at this time when orderly communion has succeeded doubtful experiment, it must not be supposed that any such harmonious results characterize the initiatory proceedings of the spiritual movement which now made its advent in Rochester. Within and without the dwellings of the medium, all was fear, consternation, doubt, and anxiety. Fanatical religionists of different sects had forced themselves into the family gatherings, and the wildest scenes of rant, cant, and absurdity often ensued. Opinions of the most astounding nature were hazarded concerning the object of this movement, some determining that it was a millennium and looking for the speedy reign of a personal Messiah and the equally speedy destruction of the wicked. It must not be supposed that the clergy were idle spectators of the tumultuous wave that was sweeping over the city. On the contrary, several of them called on Mrs. Fox with offers to exorcise the spirits, and when they found their attempts futile, and that though the spirits would rap in chorus to the amens with which they concluded their incantations, they were otherwise unmoved by these reverent performances, they generally ended by proclaiming abroad that the family were in league with the evil one, or the authors of a vile imposture. Honorable exceptions, however, were found to this cowardly and unchristian course, and amongst these was the Reverend A. H. Jervis, a Methodist minister of Rochester, in whose family remarkable manifestations occurred of the same character as in that of the Foxes, and whose appreciation of the beauty and worth of the communications he received. Several of his published letters bear witness of. Mr. Lyman Granger, Reverend Charles Hammond, Deacon Hale, and several other families of wealth and influence, both in Rochester and the surrounding towns, also began to experience similar phenomena in their own households. While the news came from all quarters, extending as far as Cincinnati and St. Louis, West, and Maine, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York, East, that the mysterious rappings and other phases of what is now called medium power were rapidly spreading from town to town and state to state, in fulfillment of an assurance made in the very first of the communications to the Fox family, namely, that these manifestations were not to be confined to them, but would go all over the world. The remarkable manner in which this prophecy has been fulfilled the most casual observer will readily admit, for spiritualism, even as a religious power, has far outstripped any other form of religion in the world in the rapidity of its growth, having reached every civilized nation and permeated every other form of belief in less than half a century. The Fox sisters were still called the Rochester Knockers, the Fox girls, the Rappers, and other epithets, equally foolish and obnoxious to their interests and feelings. Catherine Fox, the youngest girl, had been removed to the house of Mr. W. E. Capron, of Auburn. Mrs. Fish, though generally present when phenomena were transpiring, was not in its earliest phases conscious of being a medium. Margaretta, the other sister, was then in reality the only one through whom the manifestations appeared to proceed, when in November, 1848, the spirits, who had long been urging them to permit public investigations to be made through her mediumship, informed them by raps that they could not always strive with him, and since they were constantly disobedient to the spirit's requests, and obviously opposed to their presence, they should leave them, and in all probability withdraw for another generation, or seek through other sources for the fulfillment of the high and holy purposes for which this spiritual outpouring had been designed. To these appeals the family were inflexible. They constantly prayed that the cup of this great bitterness might pass from them. They did not wish to be mediums, and abhorred the notoriety, scandal, and persecution which their fatal gift had brought them, and when warned that the spirits would leave them, they protested their delight at the announcement, and expressed their earnest desire that it might be fulfilled. There were present at a circle, when communications of this character were made, several influential persons of the city, who had become greatly interested in the manifestations and were warm friends of the family. They could not, however, realize that the threat here implied would actually be fulfilled until the spirits, by rappings, spelled out several messages of a particularly affectionate and valedictory character. The scene became, says an eyewitness, solemn and impressive. The spirits announced that in 20 minutes they would depart, and exactly as that time expired they spelled out, "We will now bid you all farewell," when the raps entirely ceased. The family expressed themselves glad to get rid of them. The friends present vainly tried to obtain, by solicitations, made, as it would seem, to empty air, some demonstration that this beneficent and wonderful visitation had not indeed wholly ceased. All was useless. A mournful silence filled the apartment which had but a few minutes before been tenanted with angels, sounding out their messages of undying affection, tender counsel, wise instruction, and prescient warning. The spirits indeed were gone, and as one by one the depressed party separated and passed out into the silent moonlit streets of Rochester, all and each of them felt as if some great light had suddenly gone out, and life was changed to them. There was a mighty blank in space and a shadow everywhere, but spirit light came no more to illuminate the thick darkness. A fortnight passed away, during which the former investigators called constantly on the Fox family to inquire if their spirit friends had returned. For the first few days a stoical negative was their only reply. After this, they began more and more fully to recognize the loss they had sustained. The wise counselors were gone, the sources of strange strength and superhuman consolation were cut off. The tender, loving, wonderful presence no more flitted around their steps, cheered their meals, encouraged them in their human weakness, or guided them in their blindness. And these most wonderful and providential beings their own waywardness had driven from them. At last, then, they met their inquiring friends with showers of tears, choking sobs, and expressions of the bitterest self-reproach and regret. On the 12th day of this great heart dearth, Mr. W. E. Capron, being in Rochester on business, called at the house of Mrs. Fish, with Mr. George Willits, a member of the Society of Friends, and one of their earliest spiritual investigators. On receiving the usual sorrowful reply that the spirits had left them, Mr. Capron said, "Perhaps they will rap for us if not for you." They then entered the hall and put the usual question if the spirits would rap for them, in answer to which, and to the unspeakable delight of all present, they were greeted with a perfect shower of the much lamented sounds. Once more the spirits urged them to make the manifestations public. Again they reiterated the charge with solemn earnestness, and despite of the medium's continued aversion to the task imposed upon them, the fear of a fresh and final bereavement of the inestimable boon of spirit communion prevented their continued resistance to the course proposed. When the persons who were called upon to aid the mediums and take somewhat prominent parts in the work urged the awkwardness of the positions assigned them, the spirits only replied, "Your triumph will be so much the greater." There is no doubt that the severe warning they had just received, and the fear of its repetition, acted upon the whole party with more force than any argument that could have been used to induce their submission. At the injunctions of the spirits a public investigation into the possibility of communion between the world of spirits and the earth they once inhabited was carried out. Magistrates, editors, and professional men were the judges, and enlightened American citizens the jury. The aim of widespread publicity was attained. Thousands heard and wondered at, and finally believed in spiritual communion who would never have dreamed of the subject but for the persecution and slander that was publicly directed against the Rochester knockers. The records of these persecutions and slanders abound with disgraceful and painful incidents which, whilst being discreditable to the persons responsible for their propagation, redound with full credit to the honor and integrity of the mediums selected by the spirit world to be the forerunners of a new dispensation. And thus the fiery cross, carried by the hands of unseen messengers, sped from point to point, the beacon fires lighted by invisible hands gleamed on every mountain top, and the low muffled sound of the spirit raps that first broke the slumbers of the peaceful inhabitants of the humble tenement at Hydesville, became the clarion peal that sounded out to the millions of the Western Hemisphere, the anthem of the soul's immortality, chorused by hosts of God's bright ministering angels.